Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. It was supposed to be a peaceful Mother's Day for 66-year-old Margaret Hale. She waited for her son's usual text, but instead her phone buzzed with a message from her daughter-in-law, Victoria. You don't deserve love. Not from him, not from anyone. The sting of those words hit Margaret hard, but the real twist was still to come. Margaret had quietly watched as her son slowly pushed her out of his life. But what Victoria didn't know was that the very woman she had belittled for years was the one who owned the penthouse they lived in. The life Victoria had built was built on Margaret's generosity, and now it was all coming to an end. The morning light in Seattle was soft, casting pale shadows across the kitchen. The air smelled faintly of basil from last night's dinner. I stood at the sink rinsing a mug, the sound of running water mixing with the distant hum of the city outside. It was Mother's Day. For years it had meant a call from my son Daniel. He would text me a picture from some hike or trip we'd taken when he was younger, a memory before the day turned busy. I set the mug on the table, still waiting for the message I'd been anticipating, just like every other Mother's Day. I could hear the kettle starting to whistle, but my hands stayed still, hovering over my phone. Daniel had worked late all week, I reminded myself. He would text once he was up. I kept refreshing the screen, each time more desperate. Nothing. The house felt unnaturally quiet. Then my phone buzzed. I looked down. The message wasn't from Daniel. It was from Victoria. For a brief second, I imagined it was some kind of olive branch. Maybe she was apologizing for not calling earlier. Maybe there was a picture of the baby or a funny story about Daniel. But when I read the message, it hit like a punch to the gut. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a photo or a greeting. It was cold. You don't deserve love. Not from him. Not from anyone. I stood there, phone in hand, unable to move. I blinked, read the words again, and then again. But it was the same every time. The hurt echoed in my chest like a drum beat. I set the phone down, but my hands were shaking. My breath quickened, and I could feel my heart slamming against my ribs. It was as though the walls of the house had suddenly leaned in, waiting for something to fill the silence. The kettle clicked off in the background, but I didn't hear it. My mind was spinning, thinking back over the years, remembering the subtle ways Victoria had tried to push me out. The quiet dinner cancellations. The holidays I wasn't invited to. The times Daniel's voice had become more distant, more rehearsed. I had tried so hard to stay quiet, to make myself easy to love, but it was never enough. My gaze moved slowly to the garden outside. The tulips, just like they always did in early spring, had started to bloom. Richard and I planted them years ago. He used to argue with me about the colors. I wanted the pale ones soft and shy. He always pushed for the bold, fiery reds and oranges. He said they looked like the sunrise. I could hear his voice now, just faintly, as if it had been carved into the air. He'd always wanted to bring warmth into everything, but today all the colors in the garden seemed muted, as though the earth itself understood that something was wrong. My mind couldn't let go of the words on the screen. I walked over to the table, picked up the phone, and looked at the message again. I felt like I was falling into a hole, the world around me becoming hazy and far away. I closed my eyes and leaned against the table. 5 years? That's how long it had taken for me to become invisible. The first cracks appeared after their wedding, small things at first dinners, where I wasn't invited, small comments about my health. You know, Mom, you're not as young as you used to be. Maybe you should take it easy. Then the exclusions became routine. At first, I didn't want to see it. It was easy to tell myself that they were busy, that things were changing, but I had never been one to miss the small signs. I thought of the last Christmas I spent alone. Daniel and Victoria came by in the late afternoon after their brunch with her family. It felt like a drop-in, nothing special, just a few minutes to exchange gifts. Victoria handed me a candle that smelled faintly of vanilla, the kind you'd buy at a discount store when you didn't know what else to get. Daniel handed me a gift card. A practical one. He'd probably just grabbed it on his way out the door. I spent weeks knitting him a sweater. Navy blue, the same color as his father's eyes. Victoria barely looked at it before suggesting Daniel might prefer something more modern. I didn't say anything. What could I say? It was like I didn't matter anymore. I sank down into the chair at the kitchen table, my phone still sitting there, the screen glowing with her message. Victoria had never been kind to me. I'd tried to brush it off to give her space to tell myself that she was just different. But today, after 5 years of biting my tongue, it was clear. She had been trying to erase me from their lives little by little. I was a relic from a past they no longer needed. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only noise in the room. The house felt cold. Empty. I picked up the phone again and considered calling Daniel, but I knew it wouldn't make any difference. He hadn't even bothered to wish me a happy Mother's Day. The message I'd received was exactly the kind of thing I had come to expect from Victoria. Cold. Calculating. If I confronted her, she would say it was a misunderstanding, that I was too sensitive. But this time, I wasn't going to ignore it. I stood up and walked over to the window. The tulips were still standing there, bright in their quiet way. I hadn't really noticed them before. In the past, I would have smiled, maybe even called Richard over to take a look, but today they seemed like just another thing I had been forced to accept. I picked up my cup, now forgotten, and held it in my hands. I had no idea what to do next. The man I had married, the life we'd built together, was slipping away. My son, the boy I had raised, had turned into a stranger. Victoria had worked her way into the space I used to occupy in their lives, and I was left with a message that told me everything I needed to know. But still, I couldn't let go of the thought that maybe, just maybe, this was all some kind of mistake. Maybe Daniel didn't really know what was going on. Maybe he didn't understand how she had manipulated him, how she had turned him against me. But as I stood there holding the mug, the thought that perhaps I was wrong started to fade. I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Victoria had made her intentions clear, and now it was up to me to decide what I was going to do about it. I took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the edge of something bigger than just a hurtful message. I walked back to the table, picked up my phone again, and stared at Daniel's number. I was done waiting. It was time for him to hear the truth. I dialed. Richard. I never thought it would come to this. I never thought the boy I raised, the one who sat in my lap and whispered his dreams, would grow so far away from me. It wasn't his fault, I knew that, but it was still hard to admit. How did it all change so quickly? How did I become the woman left standing at the edge of their life, watching as it moved further and further out of my reach? I stood up from the table, feeling the weight of that thought settle over me like a heavy blanket. The house felt colder than it had before, and even the sound of the wind against the window seemed far away. I walked slowly to the living room, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The house used to be filled with noise, the sound of Daniel running through the halls, his laughter bouncing off the walls. Now it felt hollow. empty. The phone sat on the coffee table, its screen dark. I had no reason to believe Daniel would suddenly call, but a part of me still hoped for it. I wanted him to call and apologize, to tell me that he didn't mean the way things had turned out. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. I had been pushed aside, and not just by Victoria. Daniel had let it happen, and that was the hardest part. I remembered their wedding, how excited I had been. I had spent hours making sure my dress was perfect, wanting to look my best for the day. I wanted to show Daniel that I supported his choices, even though I had my doubts about Victoria. She was sweet at first, or at least she seemed to be. But there was always something behind those polite smiles, something that felt like she was playing a role. And now, as I stood in this quiet house, I couldn't help but wonder if she had been playing me from the start. Had she been strategic, slowly pushing me out of the picture so she could take my place? Was I just a means to an end? A stepping stone to her perfect life with Daniel? I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was all around me. The canceled dinners, the lack of phone calls, the absence from family events. It all added up. I sank onto the couch, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. The room seemed to close in. My thoughts were scattered, but they all circled back to the same painful truth: I was losing my son. The phone buzzed, suddenly startling me. I reached for it, my heart pounding in my chest, but it was just a notification from the grocery store. My fingers hovered over the screen, and I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. For a moment, I thought about calling Daniel, telling him how much I missed him, how much I wanted to be a part of his life again. But I knew it wouldn't help. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. I glanced at the clock on the wall. The hours were slipping by, and I was no closer to understanding where I went wrong. I thought about all the years I had spent raising Daniel, all the sacrifices I had made, all the love I had poured into him. And now it felt like it was all slipping through my fingers. I stood up abruptly, feeling the need to move, to do something. I walked to the kitchen and opened the cabinet, staring at the half-empty bottles of wine I had forgotten about. I picked one up absent-mindedly, running my fingers over the label. Richard would have poured me a glass by now. He always knew when I needed it, when the weight of everything became too much. But Richard was gone, and I was left with a house full of memories and a son who didn't need me anymore. I poured myself a glass, the liquid swirling in the glass as I tried to steady my hand. The wine wasn't the answer, I knew that. It never had been. But sometimes it made the pain a little less sharp, a little more bearable. I carried the glass back to the living room and sat down again, staring at the empty chair across from me. I could almost see Richard sitting there, his warm smile, his steady presence. He used to tell me that everything would be okay, that we would get through whatever came our way. And maybe we would have if he had been here to help guide us. But he wasn't. And now I was here alone, trying to figure out how to fix something that felt beyond repair. The phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text from Daniel. It was short, just a simple, "Hey Mom, hope you're doing okay. Talk soon. No Happy Mother's Day. No mention of the party, of the baby, of anything that had once meant something to us." I set the phone down without replying. It wasn't enough. It never would be. I stared at the empty space on the couch where Richard used to sit. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him why things had turned out this way, why Daniel had pulled away, why I was left here to pick up the pieces. But he wasn't here. He couldn't answer me. And I was left with nothing but my own thoughts, my own pain, and the quiet, oppressive silence of the house. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of everything press down on me. I tried to remember the last time I had felt truly happy, truly loved by my son. It felt like a lifetime ago, a time before Victoria came into the picture, a time when Daniel would still look at me and smile the way he used to when he was a little boy. But that boy was gone. And in his place was a man who barely had time for me, a man who was more interested in keeping the peace with his wife than in understanding me. I took another sip of the wine, trying to push the thoughts away. They lingered like a dark cloud hovering over me. I had been replaced. Slowly, quietly, but surely. And now, it was just a matter of whether I could find a way to rebuild what had been lost. But I wasn't sure I could. Not anymore. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the garden. The tulips had opened fully now, their delicate petals spread wide. They looked beautiful, but they didn't seem to belong to this place anymore. The garden, once a symbol of the life Richard and I had built, now felt foreign to me. It was like everything else in my life, something I had nurtured and cared for only to have it slip away when I wasn't looking. I turned away from the window and walked back to the couch. It was too quiet, too empty. I had no answers, no way of fixing what had been broken. But I knew one thing: I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. Not anymore. The phone buzzed again. I didn't look at it this time. I already knew what it would say. I walked out of the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. The silence was suffocating. The garden, once a space full of life and laughter, now felt like a graveyard of memories. I had never felt so disconnected from the world around me, so completely invisible. It wasn't just the house that was empty. It was me too. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I didn't check it. I knew it was Daniel, or more likely a text from Victoria. I didn't want to see their words. Not today. Not after everything. I pulled open the front door and stepped into the fresh spring air, the sun trying to push through the clouds. I had a choice to make. I could stay home, let the emptiness settle deeper into my bones, or I could force myself to do something, anything, to keep my mind from dwelling on what had been lost. The invitation from Linda Chen flashed in my mind, her warm smile and the offer of company. She had invited me to brunch, the kind of casual, neighborly invitation that people give out of kindness. I could feel her hope that I wouldn't spend the day alone. But I couldn't. I couldn't sit around a table pretending to be part of a family when mine had turned its back on me. I had to go somewhere else, somewhere that felt real, somewhere that still held meaning. I drove to the cemetery, the place where Richard had been laid to rest 3 years ago. The streets of the neighborhood were quiet, the trees lining the road still bare from winter's grip. The cemetery was just a few miles from our house, a place I visited regularly. It wasn't morbid for me, it was comforting. Being near him helped me feel closer to the life we had built, to the love that had once been so strong between us. I parked the car and walked slowly toward the grave. The sun was higher now, casting a soft light across the headstones. I stopped in front of Richard's grave and knelt, touching the cool stone. I ran my fingers along the engraving of his name, the date of his birth, and the date he left us. I closed my eyes and let the quiet of the cemetery wash over me. "Richard," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this. Our son, he's gone. Not in the way we thought he would be, but he's gone. And I'm here, left behind." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. It felt like a sign, like he was still with me, watching over me, reminding me that I wasn't truly alone. But even the comfort of his presence couldn't drown out the pain of being rejected, of being erased from the life I had fought so hard to create. "I wish you were here," I said, my voice breaking. "I need you. I need to know how to reach him, how to get him back." I paused, thinking about the future. I wanted to be a part of his life, especially now with a grandchild on the way. I had imagined this moment for years, holding my first grandbaby, helping Daniel and Victoria as they navigated parenthood. I had imagined spending holidays together, being included in the celebrations that were supposed to mean something. But now all of that was slipping away. Tears welled up in my eyes as I sat there, the weight of everything pressing down on me. My heart ached with the realization that I may never be part of their lives again. It was a pain I didn't know how to deal with. I wiped my eyes, feeling the cool breeze on my face, and slowly stood up. There was nothing left to say to Richard, nothing left to ask. I had already said it all, but the ache in my chest wouldn't go away. I wanted him to be here to tell me what to do, to tell me how to make everything right. But I was alone now, truly alone. As I walked back to the car, my phone buzzed again. This time I didn't even look. I knew it was them, Daniel and Victoria, probably asking about the house or trying to explain themselves. But I couldn't bring myself to open that door again. I couldn't listen to their excuses, to their apologies that would never be enough. I got into the car and drove away, my mind spinning. I knew I had to keep moving, keep putting one foot in front of the other, but it felt like everything was slipping away. On my way home, I passed by the Hendersons' house. They were having a barbecue, the familiar sounds of laughter and music drifting through the open windows. The smell of grilled meat wafted in the air. The sight of their family gathered together made my heart ache. I wanted so badly to be part of something like that again, to feel needed, to feel like I belonged. But I couldn't bring myself to go. It would have been too much, too painful. I turned away, my hand on the wheel, my heart heavy in my chest. I knew they meant well, but I wasn't ready to be the charity case, the lonely mother who needed a place to sit. I wasn't ready to accept that version of myself. When I got home, the house was just as empty as I had left it. The silence greeted me like an old friend. I walked through the rooms, touching the familiar objects, family pictures, a vase Richard had given me years ago. But nothing felt the same. Everything felt distant, as if I was seeing it for the first time. I sat down on the couch, staring at the empty space across from me. Richard's chair, once filled with his easy smile and steady presence, was now just a place for me to remember what was missing. I had spent so many years trying to be the best mother, the best grandmother, the best friend. But now all that effort seemed to have been in vain. Daniel was gone, lost to me, and I couldn't fix it. Victoria had won, had taken him away from me, and I had no power to change that. But even as the tears began to rise, I knew I had to keep going. I had to find a way to live with this new version of my life. A life without Daniel. A life without the family I had once known. But for now, all I could do was sit in the quiet and wonder how everything had gone so wrong. How the love I had given so freely had turned into this emptiness, this unbearable silence. And maybe, just maybe, I would find a way to fill it again. I stood in the middle of the empty room, the silence pressing in on me like a heavy weight. The house, once full of Richard's laughter and Daniel's youthful energy, now felt like an abandoned place. I hadn't realized how much of my life had been tied to this space until now, how much of my identity had been wrapped up in being part of their lives. But now, as I stared at the empty walls, it was clear I was no longer part of the picture. The phone buzzed again on the coffee table. This time, it was an email notification. I hesitated before picking it up. It was from Cole Williamson, Richard's lawyer. I had been avoiding this for weeks, putting off the conversation about the estate, about everything Richard had left behind. I hadn't wanted to face it, not when my world felt like it was falling apart. But there was no escaping it now. I clicked open the email, my hands still trembling from the rush of emotions that had been building up over the past days. It was a simple message, one that had no immediate urgency, yet it felt like the ground beneath me shifted when I read it. The attachment was a scanned document, a deed, a lease agreement. It all clicked into place as I read through it. I had no idea what Richard had done, no clue about the depth of his planning. But there it was. I was the owner of Emerald Heights Apartments. The building had been purchased in 2010, just a few years after Richard and I had moved to Seattle. He had kept it quiet, probably to shield me from worrying about finances, just as he had done with so many other things. I stared at the numbers in disbelief. Richard had passed away in 2021, and the ownership had transferred to me after his death. But it wasn't just the building that took me by surprise. It was the fact that Daniel and Victoria had been living in the penthouse for the past 4 years, paying a mere $3,800 a month in rent, a fraction of the market price. The real price for a penthouse in Emerald Heights was over $11,500 a month. Over the course of 4 years, they had saved nearly $370,000 money that had stayed in my accounts all along, while they lived in luxury, pretending everything was just as it seemed. My hands gripped the paper tightly as I sank into the chair, my breath catching in my throat. How had they managed to keep this from me? How had Victoria manipulated Daniel into accepting this arrangement without telling me she had been living off me, using my generosity to build her life, and all the while she had the nerve to send me that cruel message? I closed my eyes, the weight of it all hitting me like a physical blow. I could almost hear her voice, the way she had told me so coldly that I didn't deserve love. I could feel the sting of her words, but now they had a deeper meaning. The truth of what had been happening behind my back made me sick to my stomach. I whispered to myself, the words coming out hoarse. She's been living off me this whole time, and she still has the nerve to tell me I don't deserve love. The irony of it all settled over me like a thick fog. Victoria had carefully woven herself into Daniel's life, and now she was reaping the rewards of everything Richard had built for us. She had been using me, and worse, she had convinced Daniel that I was the problem. She had manipulated him into thinking that I was weak, that I couldn't handle the truth, that I didn't belong in their new life. It wasn't just the money. It was everything. The years of my life that had been spent nurturing this family, believing that we were building something strong, only for it to be torn apart piece by piece. My mind spun with all the moments I had missed, all the signs I had ignored because I wanted so desperately to believe in the family we had once been. I needed to see it. I needed to see where they had been living, what they had been hiding. I grabbed my purse and drove over to Emerald Heights, the building now sitting in front of me like a monument to all the things I had failed to notice. As I pulled into the parking lot, I felt a knot form in my stomach. The penthouse was on the top floor, the best view in the building. I had seen the pictures, the way Victoria always made sure to post about their perfect life. The designer furniture, the high-end finishes, the parties with friends who all thought she was perfect. What they didn't know was that all of it had been built on my money. I stood in the lobby for a moment, the polished floors reflecting the light, the faint scent of luxury lingering in the air. The doorman greeted me with a polite nod, his face unreadable. I hadn't been here in years. Not since Richard had taken me out for a special dinner when the building was first purchased. It had always felt like a dream, a place I could never truly be a part of. Now it felt like a betrayal. I made my way to the elevator, pressing the button for the top floor. The ride felt too short. When the doors opened, I stepped into the hallway, the silence inside almost suffocating. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me, the unfairness of it all. But I wasn't going to cry. I had done enough of that. The door to their penthouse was locked, but the doorman had given me a key. I didn't know why he had trusted me with it. Maybe he didn't realize who I was. Or maybe he did. Either way, it felt wrong. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The apartment was exactly as I had imagined it. The marble countertops gleamed, the large windows offered a stunning view of the city, and the furniture looked like it had been picked straight out of a catalog. It was beautiful, no doubt, but it was also empty. Empty in a way that made my heart ache. I walked further into the apartment, my shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floors. I could almost hear Victoria's voice, that fake sweetness she always used when she was pretending to be nice. The one that hid the contempt she really felt for me. I walked to the living room and looked out the window. The city sprawled beneath me, the skyline stretching far beyond the horizon. But as I stood there looking out over the life they had built, I realized something. It was all a lie. Everything they had was built on my generosity, on my ignorance. And it was time for me to stop pretending I didn't see it. It was time for me to take control. I turned and walked out of the apartment, the door clicking shut behind me. The weight of everything, of the years of manipulation, the years of my life that had been stolen from me, suddenly felt like too much to bear. But I wasn't going to let it crush me. Not anymore. The air in the office was thick with anticipation as I sat across from Cole Williamson, the lawyer Richard had worked with for years. His office was orderly, too neat, as though it belonged to someone who had never had the time to enjoy the mess of life. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall echoed in the quiet, matching the pulse of my thoughts. Cole looked at me over the rim of his glasses, his expression unreadable. "I understand this is a difficult situation, Margaret," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But you have rights. Full control over this property. It's all in Richard's will, and the law is clear on this. You don't have to renew the lease if you don't want to." I stared at him, my mind racing. But what about Daniel and Victoria? What about their lives here? He shook his head. "The lease is under your name, Margaret. Legally, you don't owe them any special treatment. If you choose, you can simply notify them of your decision to terminate the lease, giving them 60 days to vacate." The words felt like a punch to the gut. It was as if someone had peeled back the layer of false comfort I had been hiding behind. I had spent so long trying to figure out how to handle this with grace, trying to be the good mother-in-law, the understanding parent. But now it was clear I had the power, the full authority to make the decision. "You're sure about this?" I asked the question, sounding strange, even to me. I had spent so many years believing that my role was to give, to sacrifice. It felt foreign to think of taking something back, of standing up for myself in a way that wasn't just about enduring pain. Cole nodded slowly, tapping a pen against the desk. "Absolutely." "As the property owners, you have the right to change the terms of the lease or end it altogether. You've had enough time to let them settle in, and it's your choice now whether to let that continue." The weight of his words hit me like a wave. I had been living under the illusion that I needed to consider their feelings, that somehow I was responsible for their comfort. But I wasn't. The truth was that they had been living on my generosity all along, taking advantage of me while making me feel like an outsider in my own family. I swallowed hard, trying to push past the sting of it all. "So what's the next step? You just need to provide formal notice," Cole explained. "A written letter stating your intent to terminate the lease. And you don't even need to explain why if you don't want to. Just 60 days, that's all it takes." The sense of power I had never truly allowed myself to feel began to settle into my chest. It was like the fog that had clouded my mind for so long was starting to lift. I had a choice. I didn't have to live in this limbo anymore. I didn't have to be the one who always accepted the scraps of love they threw my way. I looked up at Cole, a decision forming in my mind. "Can you prepare that letter? I want it sent as soon as possible." He raised an eyebrow, surprised at the sudden shift in my demeanor. "Of course. I'll have it ready for you today. And as I said, you can choose how you want to deliver it. If you want to keep things professional, you can mail it or have the building's management deliver it." I leaned forward, the weight of the moment sinking in. No, I want it handed directly to them. I want Victoria to see it, to understand exactly what's happening. Cole's face softened, the professional barrier he had been maintaining finally cracking just slightly. He nodded. "I'll make sure it's done. I can have Kyle the doorman deliver it to their unit." He'll make sure they get it. A cold sense of satisfaction washed over me as I imagined the moment Victoria would read those words. Her carefully constructed world would crumble, and she would realize that her manipulation had gone too far. I was no longer the invisible mother she could push aside. I was the one holding the cards now. "Thank you, Cole," I said, standing up. My voice was steady, more so than it had been in days. "Please send it as soon as you can." He stood as well, offering a smile that was more kind than professional. "Take care, Margaret. This won't be easy, but it's the right thing to do." I left his office with the weight of the world still on my shoulders, but also with a sense of purpose I hadn't had in a long time. I wasn't just going to sit back and let them take everything from me. Not anymore. The drive home felt different, the hum of the engine steady and familiar, but the thoughts swirling in my mind were sharp-focused. I knew what I had to do. I had to reclaim my power. I had to stop being the woman who waited for scraps of love and start being the one who demanded respect. When I pulled into the driveway, I took a deep breath and looked up at the house. It was the same house I had lived in for years, the one Richard and I had made our home. It was still full of memories, but now it felt like I was standing at the edge of something new. I went inside, and the silence welcomed me like an old friend. The house hadn't changed, but I had. I no longer felt like the invisible mother, the one who was too old, too weak to be part of their world. I was stronger than I had been in years, and I had a plan. I sat down at the kitchen table and pulled out my phone. I dialed the number for the building's management company and told them what I needed. "Have Kyle deliver the letter to the penthouse, please. Today, if possible." The words felt good to say. It was a small step, but it was mine. It was the first real move I had made in years to take back control of my life. As I hung up, I sat there for a moment staring at the phone. The weight of what I had just done still hadn't fully hit me. It was like I was holding my breath, waiting for the consequences to follow. But they didn't scare me. They couldn't scare me anymore. I was done being the passive one, the one who accepted everything, no matter how hurtful. I was done being the victim of their cruelty. Now I was the one making decisions, and it was about time. The evening air was crisp, a cool breeze sweeping through the streets of Seattle. Victoria was in a good mood, or at least she appeared to be. She walked through the front doors of the building, the polished marble floors reflecting her confident stride. She had just finished a meeting with the charity board, no doubt enjoying the adoration and the praise she had received. Her smile was bright, a touch too bright, as she greeted Kyle the doorman, who nodded politely but said nothing. Victoria always walked with an air of superiority, like she was above everything. I watched from my car across the street, parked in the shadows, a glass of red wine in my hand. The taste was rich, smooth, but tonight it tasted bitter as I took a sip. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even angry. I was simply watching, waiting. I had done my part, and now the stage was set. I could see her laughing as she reached the elevator, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit her. I knew the letter I had arranged for Kyle to deliver would take a few moments to reach her, but that didn't bother me. I wanted her to have those moments, the ones where everything seemed fine, before everything came crashing down. Inside the building, Victoria was still smiling, her thoughts likely on the high praise she had received during the charity meeting. The elevator doors slid open, and as she stepped into the penthouse hallway, she looked up at Kyle. His face was unreadable, the professional mask he wore hiding his emotions. He handed her the envelope, and for a moment she stopped. I could almost hear the little gasp of surprise. Maybe she didn't think she would be getting anything today, but it was the letter she would never forget. Victoria's smile faltered as she took the envelope. It was official-looking, sealed tightly. The address was clearly marked my name on it. Her eyes darted from the envelope to Kyle, but he remained impassive. He hadn't said anything, and I knew he wouldn't. He was just the messenger. I leaned back in my seat, letting the warmth of the wine spread through me. I could picture it so clearly. Victoria standing there in the hallway, tearing open the letter with the same urgency she applied to everything in her life. The sound of paper being ripped open, her eyes scanning the words. The shock, the disbelief. I could almost hear her voice in my head as she read the words that would change everything. The lease had been terminated. 60 days to vacate the premises. There was no room for negotiation, no excuses, just the cold, hard truth staring her in the face. Her expression shifted instantly. I could see it in my mind's eye, the arrogance draining from her face, replaced by something I hadn't seen on her before. Fear, shock, panic. Her proud stance crumpled, and I felt a small satisfaction in watching her crumble under the weight of what was happening. She wasn't as untouchable as she thought. It didn't take long for her to grab her phone and dial Daniel's number. I knew what she would say before she even spoke. Her voice would be panicked, that controlled facade slipping away. It was a tone I hadn't heard from her before, a tone that was raw with emotion, the one she reserved for when she thought she was losing control. I took another sip of wine, savoring the moment. I could almost hear the frantic words she was speaking into the phone. "Daniel," she would say, her voice rising with panic. "You have to come here. Something's happened. Someone's done something. I don't know who, but they've just ended the lease. We have 60 days. Who would do this to us?" I could see her pacing back and forth in the living room, phone pressed to her ear, her mind racing to find an explanation. She had no idea, no clue that it was me, The very person she had so expertly pushed to the side, the one she had tried to erase from Daniel's life. The very person whose power, unbeknownst to her, had just taken back control. Daniel would be confused, angry even. I could imagine him standing there, rubbing his temples as he listened to her. He would probably think it was some mistake, some misunderstanding, and maybe he would even try to fix it. But no matter what he did, the fact remained. Victoria had no idea who her landlord was. I set the wine glass down, feeling the smallest sense of satisfaction bubble up inside me. The tables had turned, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand. I wasn't the woman who was ignored anymore, the one who couldn't fight back. I was the one pulling the strings now. I could hear her voice on the other end of the phone, probably pleading with him to do something to fix this, to make it go away. And then she would realize that nothing could fix this. Not anymore. Not after everything she had done. I closed my eyes, leaning back in the seat, listening to the hum of the street. There was a strange peace in knowing that the ball was in my court now. I wasn't the victim anymore. I wasn't the helpless mother-in-law who had to beg for a place in her son's life. No, I was the one making decisions now, and there was power in that, a power I hadn't felt in years. I allowed myself to smile, a small, quiet smile that was more for me than for anyone else. I could already picture her face when the realization hit her, when she finally understood who had been pulling the strings all along. I leaned forward again, glancing at the clock. I imagined them now, Daniel and Victoria, standing in the penthouse trying to figure out what to do. The reality of it would hit her hard, but it was a lesson she needed to learn. She had spent so long pretending to be above me, pretending that she could take my son away without consequence. Well, the consequences were here now. And there was no turning back. The doorbell rang sharply, pulling me from my thoughts. I stood up slowly, walking to the door. It was Kyle. I knew what he was here for. He was just following orders. But for me, it felt like a symbolic moment. He handed me the paper, a final confirmation of everything that had just happened. I glanced at it one last time, the letter that would change everything. The decision had been made, and there was no going back. I smiled again, the taste of victory sweet on my lips. Victoria had no idea who she had crossed, and she was about to find out. The phone rang, cutting through the stillness of the evening. I let it ring once, twice, before finally picking it up. It was Daniel. "Mom, there's been some sort of mistake." His voice crackled through the speaker, the tone urgent but unsure. "I just saw the letter. We've never been late on rent. You know that." I didn't respond immediately. I could feel the tension building, the calmness I had carefully cultivated in the past few days hanging in the air like a fragile thread. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I needed to stay calm, stay in control. "Daniel," I said slowly, my voice even, "how much are you paying each month?" There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost picture him, the wheels turning, as he tried to remember the specifics. $3,800. It's a special deal because we signed a long-term lease." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. I already knew the answer, but I needed him to say it. I needed him to hear it from himself. "And have you ever thought about who's covering the rest of the rent?" I asked, my words calculated, sharp in their simplicity. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. For the first time in the conversation, Daniel was quiet. The silence stretched out longer than I expected. I could almost hear him piecing it together, realizing what I was getting at. I don't know what you mean, Mom." he finally said, his voice faltering, but I could sense the gears shifting in his mind. The landlord gave us a discount. It's just part of the deal. We've always paid what we agreed on. It's been fine. Who's covering the rest of it, Daniel? I pressed again this time, a little firmer. The question was simple, but I could tell he wasn't sure where it was headed. He had been so wrapped up in his life with Victoria, so convinced that everything was normal that he never questioned the details. "Mom, what are you trying to say?" His voice cracked, and I heard a slight desperation in his tone. It was as if the reality of the situation was dawning on him, but he wasn't quite ready to accept it. I paused, letting the weight of his words settle between us. "Daniel, the market rent for that penthouse is $11,500 a month. You've been paying $3,800. The difference, about $7,700 each month, has been covered by me. That's roughly $370,000 over the past 4 years. Did you ever wonder who was paying that?" I could hear him swallow on the other end, the realization hitting him harder than I expected. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that fills a room when everything you thought you knew about your world is suddenly shattered. Finally, Daniel spoke again, his voice low and strained. "Mom, I didn't know." There was a hint of disbelief in his words, like he was struggling to come to terms with what I was telling him. "But why didn't you tell me?" I leaned back in my chair, the cool evening air drifting in through the window. "Because I didn't want you to feel burdened," I said softly, though my voice trembled with the weight of it. "You've had your life with Victoria, and I didn't want to be the one holding you back. But now I think it's time you knew. It's time you understood exactly what's been happening." I could hear him breathe out slowly, the anger and confusion mixing together. "I need to talk to Victoria," he muttered, his voice heavy with something I couldn't quite place. I wondered if he was starting to see her for who she really was, the woman who had taken advantage of both him and me. "You should," I said quietly, not feeling the need to say more. "You need to have that conversation." Another long pause. The kind of pause that stretches between two people when there's something unsaid, something neither of them wants to admit, but both know is true. "Okay, Mom. I'll talk to her," he said finally, his words reluctant, as though he were still processing everything. "But what happens now?" "Now?" I said slowly, my fingers running over the edge of the glass of wine I had been holding. "You have to figure out what's more important, the life you've been living, or the truth about who you've become." I could feel him on the other end trying to find the words to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. "I'm not the one who's been lying to you, Daniel. But it's time for you to open your eyes." I hung up before he could say anything else. I didn't need to hear his excuses. I had heard them all before, but now it was different. Now he had no choice but to see what his wife had done, what she had stolen from me and from him. I sat there, the phone in my hand, the silence swallowing the room. I could feel the relief, the release of tension that had built up inside me for so long. The truth was out. There was no going back for any of us. But even as I felt this small, quiet satisfaction, I knew there was still more to come. Daniel wasn't done with me yet. He would have to choose just like I had. He would have to decide whether he was going to keep living in his bubble or whether he was going to confront the woman he had married and ask the hard questions. And the truth would come out, whether he was ready for it or not. I had given him the tools to see it. Now it was up to him to use them. I stood up, walking toward the window, watching the city lights twinkle below. Seattle was beautiful at night, full of life and possibility, but tonight it felt distant. My heart was still heavy, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like I had some measure of control over my own story. The next day, Victoria's reaction was nothing short of explosive. It wasn't just frustration. It was full-on panic laced with a heavy dose of entitlement. I could almost feel the anger radiating off her through the phone as she called the building's management. She was demanding to speak to the owner. She wasn't just asking for information. She was trying to intimidate them to assert some kind of control. The kind of control she thought she had over everything. I could imagine her pacing in her high heels, probably still in the expensive dress from her charity event demanding answers. Her voice would have been shaking with barely contained rage. "You tell the owner I want to speak with them immediately. This is outrageous. I have every right to stay in this apartment," she would have snapped. The manager's response, though, was predictably impersonal and firm. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Morrison, but the owner has the right to terminate the lease. It's legal. There's nothing more to discuss." And that was it. There would be no special treatment. No one would listen to her plea. Victoria had always assumed that money and charm would solve every problem, that she could buy her way into anything, even respect. But now she was being confronted with something she couldn't control. The laws, the facts, the reality that she had built her life on lies, none of it was bending to her will anymore. Victoria's rage didn't subside. It only grew as soon as she was on the phone with her own mother, trying to figure out how to get around this. She had underestimated the power I had. She had assumed I was weak, that I wouldn't take action. She never imagined the woman she had belittled for so long would be the one to bring everything crashing down. I could almost hear her shouting at her lawyer, her voice high-pitched and panicked. "This isn't over, I'll fight this," but the legal system doesn't bend to willpower alone. There were rules, and as Cole had so calmly explained, I had every right to take control of the situation. She couldn't manipulate me like she had Daniel. She couldn't make me the villain in her narrative. Not anymore. A few days passed and the fallout began. It spread like wildfire, as these things always do. The whispers started at the charity board meetings she had attended. She was the talk of the room, though I'm sure she didn't realize it at first. The wealthy women she had once considered her peers now saw her as someone to be wary of, someone who had just lost her privileged spot in the penthouse of the city's most sought-after building. I didn't know exactly how it started, but I could imagine the conversations. "Did you hear about Victoria?" someone might have whispered. "She's out of the penthouse. Can you believe it?" Another voice would answer, equally shocked. "I thought they had everything under control. What happened?" And then, just like that, Victoria's carefully curated image of success was cracking. I could almost hear the judgment in their voices. It wasn't just about the apartment. It was about everything she had built her life around. Her status in this community, her sense of self-worth, was tied to the image of success she had so carefully crafted. Her connection to Daniel, to his family, had been her golden ticket to this world. But now that ticket was being revoked. I didn't take pleasure in her downfall, at least not in the way you might think. What I felt was a kind of satisfaction that came from watching someone who had treated me so cruelly finally face the consequences of their actions. She had spent so long telling me I wasn't worth her time, that I was nothing more than a nuisance, and now she was being exposed for the fraud that she was. The world she had worked so hard to build was starting to crumble, and I could feel the slightest glimmer of justice in that. Victoria wasn't used to being vulnerable. She had always been the one in control, always the one calling the shots, always the one who seemed to have all the power. But now she was being pushed to the edges of her carefully constructed life. The whispers were growing louder. People were starting to question her. Her place in the community, her connections, everything she had relied on to hold up her image was slipping through her fingers. She would never admit it, but I knew she was beginning to feel the weight of it all. The humiliation, the fear, the realization that her carefully built life was a house of cards ready to collapse with just one small push. It wasn't just the apartment. It wasn't just about the money. It was the loss of everything that had defined her, everything she had worked so hard to control. The fear of losing that control was something I could almost taste in the air, and it was a fear I knew well. I had lived it for years, but now for the first time in a long time, it was her turn to feel that panic. That evening, I poured myself another glass of wine, watching the soft glow of the city lights from my kitchen window. It was a strange kind of peace, the kind you only get when you've been holding your breath for so long, and finally exhale. I wasn't sure what would happen next. I didn't know how long Victoria would fight, how hard she would push, but one thing was clear. She had underestimated me, and now she would have to face the consequences of that. As I sat there, the sounds of the city below me seemed distant, almost soothing. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had reclaimed something I had lost. My dignity, my power. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me again. The phone rang early the next morning, and I knew exactly who it was before I even looked at the screen. Victoria. I had expected this call. In fact, I had been waiting for it, knowing it was only a matter of time before she'd try to reach out to somehow fix what had been broken. The question was, how would she approach it? What kind of plea would she make? I let it ring twice before picking it up, my fingers steady as I held the phone to my ear. Margaret, her voice cracked, full of anxiety and something else I couldn't quite place. "Are you the owner of the building?" I paused, letting the question hang in the air. I could hear her breath quick and uneven as she waited for my response. "Yes, Victoria," I said, my voice calm, steady, not giving anything away. "I am the owner. Is there something else you'd like to know?" Her tone shifted immediately, sharp with panic. "You're destroying my family. Do you understand that? What are you trying to do to us?" I leaned back in my chair, my hand absent-mindedly reaching for the glass of water on the table in front of me. "What did you think would happen, Victoria? After the way you treated me, the way you treated Daniel, do you really think I wouldn't respond? You've been manipulating this entire situation, and now you're paying the price for it." I could almost feel her crumbling on the other end of the line. She was losing control, and I wasn't about to let her manipulate me any longer. The calm in my voice contrasted with the storm I knew was raging inside her. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she said, her voice trembling. "I never wanted it to go this far. Please, Margaret, you have to understand. If Daniel finds out, if he knows the truth, he'll leave me. You can't do this to me. You can't destroy everything we've built." There it was. The desperation. The cracks in the facade that she had so carefully built around herself. It had all been an act. Everything about her, every decision, every word had been about maintaining her position, her image. And now she was losing it all. I took a deep breath, savoring the moment of clarity that washed over me. "Victoria, if Daniel leaves you, it's not because of me. It's because of you. You've been playing games with people's lives, and now the consequences are here. You brought this on yourself." Her breathing became even more erratic, the panic clear in every inhale. "Please, please don't let him find out. I swear I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean to be cruel. I was just trying to protect our life. I didn't know how to keep everything in balance. You didn't know how I repeated her words, my tone flat. You didn't know how to treat your own family with respect to stop using people to get what you wanted. You didn't know how to appreciate the very person who has been supporting you." There was a pause. I knew she was searching for the right words, but she wasn't going to find them. Not this time. "I'm sorry," she whispered the words barely audible. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could fix everything, but now I'm losing everything." "Victoria," I said, my voice steady, but there was no sympathy in it. "You never knew who your landlord really was, did you? You never thought that the person you'd been insulting, the one you thought was weak, was actually the one holding all the cards." She gasped, the words hitting her like a slap across the face. "What are you talking about? What do you mean?" I leaned forward, speaking slowly now, savoring every word. "The landlord you've been mocking, the one you thought was powerless. That's me. I've been the one supporting you. I've been the one who's been holding the strings all along, and you never even knew it. I am the one you've been treating like an outsider, the one you thought didn't deserve love. Well, now you see who I really am." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost feel the weight of her shock, the realization sinking in. Victoria had always assumed that she could control everything, manipulate everyone around her, especially me. But the truth was far more devastating than she could have imagined. I waited for her to speak, but the words never came. Instead, I heard her start to cry soft, broken sobs that betrayed her carefully crafted image. The woman who had once seemed so unshakable was now crumbling piece by piece right before me. "Victoria," I said, my voice cold, "now you have 55 days. 55 days to learn what it means to treat people with decency, to learn what it means to not tear apart the family that's been there for you. If you can't do that, then you'll lose everything." She was silent again, the weight of my words sinking in. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but it was too late for apologies. "I didn't know." "You never knew," I repeated, my voice firm. "And now you have to live with the consequences of that ignorance." I hung up the phone before she could say anything else. I wasn't interested in her apologies anymore. I had given her more chances than she deserved, and now it was too late. She had shown me who she really was, and I wasn't going to let her back into my life. I stared at the phone for a moment before setting it down. The silence in the house felt different now. It wasn't the oppressive silence I had become so familiar with. It was a new kind of silence, the kind that comes after a battle has been fought and won. The world felt a little bit lighter, a little bit clearer. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my own life again. I wasn't just the mother-in-law waiting for scraps of attention or affection. I was the one making the decisions now, and I was going to make sure that everything went according to my plan. Victoria had underestimated me. She had thought I was weak, but now she would learn the hard way just how wrong she had been. I had just set the phone down when I heard a knock on the door. It was sharp, insistent. At first, I wondered if it was Victoria perhaps coming to beg for another chance, or maybe trying to manipulate me with her tears. But when I opened the door, it wasn't her. It was Daniel. He stood there, his face drawn and haggard like someone who had spent days in turmoil, someone who hadn't slept in days. The usual confidence he carried had all but disappeared. In its place there was guilt. So much guilt. "Mom," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I need to talk to you." I stepped aside to let him in, noticing how he hesitated for a moment, as if uncertain whether he was welcome. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. We both knew the gravity of this moment. We both knew what had been said, what had been done, and what was at stake. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where we had shared so many conversations over the years, back when things were simple, back when he was still my boy. But now the air between us felt different, thicker, heavier. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I knew well. It was the same thing he had done when he was a child, when he was frustrated or anxious. "I messed up, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have known better. I should have seen it. I trusted Victoria. I believed her when she told me all those things about you, and I pushed you away." I could see the weight of his words hitting him. He wasn't just apologizing. He was facing the reality of his actions, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the son I had raised, the one who had been so full of love and kindness before everything got tangled up in Victoria's web of manipulation. I didn't want to believe it, he continued, his voice low. I didn't want to see what she was doing. But now I'm starting to realize how wrong I was, how I let her control everything. And in doing that, I hurt you. I hurt the one person who always had my back. I didn't say anything at first. What could I say? The hurt, the betrayal, the years of being pushed aside, it had all piled up. But I couldn't deny the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he was being honest with me, and that meant more than anything. I leaned back in my chair, taking a moment to gather my thoughts. "Daniel, I don't need you to apologize for me. I need you to choose who you want to be. Do you want to keep being the easy husband, the one who goes along with everything because it's easier? Or do you want to be the son I raised, the one who knows what's right and what's wrong, the one who stands up for what's important?" He looked at me, his eyes searching my face as if trying to figure out the right answer. I could see the conflict in him, the same conflict I had seen so many times before when he had to choose between what was easy and what was right. I don't know if I can fix everything, he said quietly, almost to himself. I've been so blind, so weak. I shook my head. It's not about fixing everything. It's about making the right choice now. About being the man you want to be, not the one Victoria wants you to be. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stared down at his hands. The silence stretched out between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when both people are thinking, reflecting. I had asked him to make a decision, and I knew this wasn't something he could take lightly. Finally, he looked up at me, his face determined. "I'm leaving the penthouse, Mom. I'm going to rent a small apartment near work. I need to start over. I need to stop letting her control me. I need to find myself again." I felt a rush of relief wash over me, so strong it almost took my breath away. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had my son back, like he was finally seeing the truth. And that was all I ever wanted. For him to see what was real. "You don't need to explain yourself to me, Daniel," I said softly. "I know how hard this is. But I'm proud of you. For making the decision to stand up for yourself, for being the man I know you can be." He smiled a small, sad smile, but it was a start. "I don't know what's going to happen with Victoria. I don't know if she'll forgive me or if I'll ever be able to fix what I've done. But I know I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not." I nodded. "You don't owe anyone an explanation. You owe it to yourself to do what's right. and that's all that matters. We sat there for a while, just the two of us, the silence between us now filled with understanding. Daniel had made his decision, and I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders, the relief that came from knowing he had chosen the right path. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be more challenges ahead. But I had my son back, and that was worth everything. After a while, Daniel stood up, running a hand through his hair again. I should go. I have some calls to make. I'll figure everything out. I stood with him, giving him a hug. I'm here always. He smiled, his eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and regret. Thanks, Mom. I'll make this right. I promise. I watched him walk out the door, feeling both heavy and light at the same time. The road ahead would be hard for him, but I knew he was on the right track. I turned back to the kitchen, looking out the window at the evening sky. For the first time in so long, I felt like I could breathe again. The past had been filled with so much hurt, so much uncertainty. But now maybe we could all start to heal. The morning Daniel announced his decision to leave, I knew it would shatter something within Victoria. As soon as he told her, the explosion was immediate. She stood there in the living room of the penthouse, face flushed with fury, hands shaking with a mix of disbelief and anger. Her voice was sharp, accusing, almost pleading, as she demanded to know how he could do this to her. "You're ruining my life, Daniel," she shouted, her eyes wide with disbelief. "From the penthouse to this, you're really going to drag me down to some dump." I could imagine her words slicing through him, especially when the life she had so carefully built was beginning to collapse. She had always thought she could control him, bend him to her will, but now that was slipping away and she could feel it. Daniel, on the other hand, was calm. The weight of his decision had settled on him, and he wasn't going to back down. "We've been living off my mother for 4 years, Victoria. It's time we start standing on our own 2 feet. I'm not going to keep doing this, not anymore." Her reaction was a blend of disbelief and frustration. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "We've worked so hard to get to this point, and you're just going to throw it all away?" "I'm not throwing anything away," Daniel replied firmly, but there was a sadness to his voice that I hadn't heard before. "I've been living a lie, and I'm not going to keep lying to myself or to you. We can't keep using my mom's money to live this life. It's not real. I want to build something real, something we can stand on together." Victoria's face turned pale as the realization set in. The foundation she had built everything on was crumbling, and it was her own doing. As Daniel walked out of the penthouse later that afternoon, I could only imagine the storm brewing inside Victoria. She had thought she could keep her hold on him forever, but now she was faced with the stark reality that everything she had worked for was slipping away. The community, the image, the lifestyle, it was all crashing down. Later that week, the rumors started to spread, as they always do in these circles. The whispers were soft at first, like a ripple that slowly grew louder. Victoria's name was removed from the charity board's list. No one mentioned it outright, but the cold shoulder was unmistakable. The people who had once admired her, envied her, even were now turning their backs. I overheard one of the board members at a meeting speaking to another. "Did you hear Victoria's out of the penthouse? She's gone." It wasn't even a question anymore. It was a statement. Her world, the one she had so carefully curated, was crumbling piece by piece. Her social status was slipping, and there was no one left to hold her up. It wasn't just her social circles. It was the entire image she had so desperately tried to maintain. The designer clothes, the luxury vacations, the constant show of affluence, it all felt so hollow now. Her world was nothing more than an illusion built on lies, and now the truth was coming out. A few days later, I knew she had been spending most of her time alone in the penthouse. I could picture her sitting on that expensive couch staring out at the skyline, the reality of what she had lost slowly sinking in. I couldn't help but feel a strange satisfaction in watching her unravel, but there was also something deeply human in the way she was falling apart. She had spent so long trying to prove something to everyone, trying to elevate herself above her circumstances, above the truth, and now she was faced with the consequences of that. I imagined her sitting alone, probably with her hands wrapped around her belly, tears streaming down her face as she realized the life she had worked so hard to create was slipping through her fingers. She had been so focused on power control and social status that she hadn't stopped to consider the cost. The baby she carried inside her would grow up in a world where those things didn't matter anymore. The truth was finally setting in for Victoria, and it was something she couldn't deny. The once untouchable superior woman was now left with nothing but the remnants of a life she had built on manipulation. All the luxury, the fame, the high status gone just like that. I couldn't help but wonder how she would face the world now. What would she say to those people who had once admired her, who now saw her for who she truly was? Would she try to salvage what was left of her reputation, or would she retreat into herself, hiding behind the walls of her penthouse that no longer offered the protection they once did? I knew one thing for sure: Victoria would never be the same again. The world she had built on cruelty and deceit was gone, and it was a long, hard road ahead for her. Whether she would learn from this, whether she would ever understand the true meaning of family loyalty and love, well, that remained to be seen. But one thing was clear: she would never be the woman she was before. And the one who had held the power all along, the one she had so foolishly tried to erase, was still standing. And I would be the one to see to it that the world understood just how wrong she had been.